go to a fully funded MD PhD program, then there should be no circumstances in which you are paying for your education. There is a little bit of confusion about where funding for our MD PhD programs come from. There's also some questions about applying for fellowship grants and whether that's required and what happens if you don't get fellowship grants as an MD PhD student. Funding for MD PhD students essentially come from about 4 different types of sources. It really depends on the institution, what funds they have access to, and each institution kind of varies on what percentage of their student funding comes from what sources. But the 4 sources are essentially: 1, institutional funds, so they can come from donors, tuition, I don't know, it's whatever private money that they have as part of the institution. Second source is the training grants, so for example a T32 is what most medical scientist training programs are funded under. The government gives the institution some money and that is used to fund students. Third source usually comes into play during the student's PhD years, so the lab will fund the student. So for example, a PI will get a R grant or a K grant, and that is used to fund the student. And last but not least, the 4th source of funding is fellowship grants. So the student themselves can apply for their own grant as their own PI to a F30 or F31 grant. The difference between F30 and F31 is that F30 also funds the med school years, whereas the F31 only funds the PhD years. Why would you ever apply to the F31 instead of the F30 if the F30 funds both the PhD and the MD? Well, the reason is usually because certain institutes only offer the F31 and not the F30. Kind of a longer story. Happy to make a video about this another time because I did apply to an F31 instead of an F30. But basically those are the 4 sources of funding. So at my institution, every student is required to apply to one of the fellowship grants, either an F30 or an F31. What happens if you don't get the fellowship? Well, from a student perspective, essentially nothing. You're just funded from one of the other 4 sources, usually your PI if you're in your PhD years. My program is fully funded through the MD and the PhD years. Not every MD PhD program is like that, but in my case, that means that the program will guarantee funding in some way throughout my entire time in training. There is a slight incentive to doing well on the F grant, and that is you get a small raise. So I think it's about $2,000 for the full year. I'm not entirely sure. And of course, getting a grant early on in your career looks really good. It starts a track record with the NIH, and it's just good practice overall for your grantsmanship if you ever plan on becoming a PI. And I think that's why my program kind of requires us to submit something. So yeah, if you're an MD PhD applicant and you're hearing people talk about the F grants, the fellowship grants, and you're kind of stressing about that, there's really no need to stress about that just yet. I know funding is kind of a complex topic, can feel a little taboo to talk about. And even now, I feel like there are nitty-gritty funding things that I don't know a whole ton about. But if you have any questions, let me know down below and I'll try to answer them.